In my paper today, I will discuss a printed roadmap, which is alternatively titled Tōkaidō bunken or Tōkaidō bunken, which translates as sectional map or illustrated sectional map of the Tōkaidō, and was first published in Japan in 1690. And the map is, I think, an interesting case study to look at in relation to the topic of this conference, because it brings cartography and literature together with peculiar clarity in a way that is at the same time somewhat typical of 17th century Japanese cartography. So as I think I'm the only Japanese studies specialist here, I will start by giving you some background information about Japan in the Edo period, which is the context in which the map was created. And then I will proceed to discuss the publication history of the map and the way it builds its narrative. So first of all, the Edo or Tokugawa period is what is commonly defined as the early modern era of Japanese history. The issue of Japanese modernity is very complex, and I wouldn't possibly be able to give it justice in this short span of time, so I don't want to dwell on it. But one point I do want to highlight is that in this phase, Japan developed its own early modernity and had only very limited contact with Europe. In fact, after coming to power at the beginning of the 17th century, the Tokugawa, the military family that had reunited the country after more than 1 century of political division and intestine war, chose to outlaw travel abroad and to limit diplomatic and commercial exchanges in general as a way to preserve political stability. The only contact that Japan had with Europe at this time was through the Dutch East India Company, which was allowed to keep a secluded settlement on a small artificial island near the port of Nagasaki. And in reference to cartography, more specifically, through the Dutch, Japanese authorities did keep more or less up to date about European surveying techniques and models of cartography, with which the Japanese had first come into contact through Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century, after having mostly relied on Chinese models for the previous centuries. And the Tokugawa even applied some of those European techniques in the land service that they systematically ordered after coming to power in order to facilitate territorial control, service that resulted in the production of many administrative maps. However, information about European cartography remained classified at least up to the 1720s, which is when the Tokugawa authorities lifted some of the restrictions in place about the circulation of European knowledge among the general public. And it was then only after the 1720s that some intellectuals outside the circles of military authorities became involved in what in Japanese is called rangaku, that is Dutch studies. We do find after that some commercial maps influenced by rangaku, maps that notably show a concern for an accurate representation of the world. But please keep in mind that even then, this was not necessarily a primary concern for commercial cartography in Japan. And this lack of concern was true even for commercial maps that were based on administrative maps that used European techniques, were based on European techniques, which was not that uncommon, as we'll see. And to understand why accuracy was not a concern for commercial maps, I need, I think, to provide some context about the production of commercial maps specifically. As the scholar Sugimoto Fumiko has highlighted, commercial maps are what turned Edo Japan in all respects into a mapped society. Maps had already been produced in Japan before the 17th century, but it was in the Edo period that the proper cartographic culture first took root, mainly thanks to the birth and growth of a publishing industry and to the fact that many publishing houses specifically capitalized on topographical works. Edo Japan saw a boom in what Itasaka Yoko has defined as Chishiteki-ko, an expression that literally translates as topographic literature, and that refers to different types of works, including travel diaries, fictional travel narratives and travel guidebooks that are united by having travel as their core topic and by other common stylistic features. One main one being that they all tend to combine, although in different measures and variations, narrative and or poetical elements with geographical descriptions and practical information about travel. And I personally argue that many maps produced from the second half of the 17th century also have a rightful place within this definition in light of how they include all these elements, as I'll try to show with Tōkaidō bunken. The reason why the market for topographic materials was wide are various. There were some factors at play that stimulated the development of the publishing industry more in general. For example, the availability of relatively cheap, strong and light paper, the fact that peace under the Tokugawa allowed to maintain an efficient sea and road network, which in turn facilitated the circulation of published materials within the country, and a general rise in living standards and high levels of literacy. It has been estimated that by the end of the Edo period, about half of the male population and 15% of the female population could read and write. There was also another factor that impacted the fortune of topography as a genre more specifically, which were the travel restrictions imposed by the Tokugawa family since the beginning of the 17th century. These restrictions established that only essential travel, it is a common expression now, sadly, was to be allowed within the country. Now, the definition of what was essential was actually very broad. It included, for example, travel to hot springs for health reasons or pilgrimage and travel connected to religion. And it's easy to gather from travel permits that have survived that wealthy people, above all from the merchant and farming classes, were often able to find ways around the restrictions in light of that. Still, in a context where actual travel wasn't always easy to access and where people who did travel generated curiosity about the experience, maps and other topographic materials often became ways for the public to virtually explore the country. And in light of this, it can be presumed that at least some maps were conceived as tools for armchair travel rather than as actual guides to travel. They were what Gilly Traganu has defined as meta-traveling tools, that is, items with travel as their subject matter that were, however, consumed in places and times other than those of the journey. And this, I think, explains why an objective representation of space wasn't necessarily their main aim. I think this helps better understand the purpose of a map like Tōkaidō bunken. The map, this is not the map, but I used it as a way to represent the main road network in Edo, Japan. The map represents one of the 5 main highways of Edo, Japan, which connected 2 of the biggest cities of the time. Edo, now Tokyo, which was the capital of the Tokugawa, and by the end of the 17th century was a metropolis of 1 million inhabitants, and Kyoto, which was the old imperial capital, which hosted some Tokugawa offices, was at the center of a very important productive and commercial area, and was also very famous for its Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. And in light of these reasons, the Tōkaidō was probably the most traveled road at the time, used by governmental officials, by local lords who periodically had to travel to Edo as part of their duties to the Tokugawa, and by merchants and shipping companies. And it was also preferred by pilgrims and recreational travelers who often were one and the same, as it ran along the coast, was renowned as a scenic route, and touched many so-called meisho or famous places. A very brief detour by boat from the road, which not by chance is represented in Tōkaidō bunken, also led to the Ise Shrine, which was connected with the imperial family and was one of the most common pilgrimage destinations of the time. It had an average of 50,000 visitors per year, and it had peaks of 5 million visitors during mass pilgrimage events. And for all these reasons, it does not surprise that the Tōkaidō was also the most commonly represented road of Edo Japan and appeared copiously in art, literature, and cartography. Among these many representations, Tōkaidō bunken, which was presumably originally conceived for a usership of rich city dwellers, was probably one of the most popular of its time. The map used the odihon, or concertina format, folded, to reproduce the 500 kilometers of the road in scale, which in its first edition was 1 to 12,000, resulting in roughly 36 meters and 5 volumes. It was originally, as you can see, in black and white woodblock print, but then was widely reprinted throughout the 18th century, sometimes with added color. This is an end color. This is a copy at the John Reinhart's Library in Manchester. Some pocket editions were also produced. For example, in 1752, the publisher Yorozuya Sebe created a version of the map in one volume, only a little over 10 meters in length. And this is probably a sign of a growing popularity of the map among a more diversified public. One interesting aspect of this map is that it was based on a land survey commissioned by the Tokugawa in 1651 for administrative purposes. The authors of this survey are Odo Ujinaga, who was an official in service of the Tokugawa, where we had also experience as surveyor, and the professional surveyor and cartographer Ochiko Chidoin. This was a team who collaborated in many administrative maps that were later turned commercial. Ochiko Chidoin was the one to produce the commercial map based on the survey by collaborating with Hishikawa Moronobu, who was a famous artist, particularly known for ukiyo-e, which were multicolored woodblock prints. It's worth noting that Moronobu was also consistently involved in the illustration of literary works, including other topographic materials such as travel guidebooks. For example, he illustrated Edo Suzume, which was a very popular guidebook to the city of Edo, published in 1677. And some of his disciples, I mentioned yesterday, the Gatti Ishikawa Ryusen, he was a disciple of Moronobu, had very similar careers working in art, cartography, and literature at the same time. And I think this gives you an idea of how a system of collaboration was in place around this time, which involved the Tokugawa officials that gave the green light to the publication of topographic materials and sometimes provided the sources for them, and the people involved in the publishing industry, including artists who had also provided a consistent bridge between different topographic genres. I think this facilitated the adoption of common stylistic choices between the different genres themselves. And it was through this system of collaboration that the systematic adaptation of the administrative map models as commercial maps happened in the second half of the 17th century. Why administrative maps were sold to commercial publishing houses in the first place, in spite of how the Tokugawa tended to be concerned about the leaking of sensitive information in many fields, is in itself, I think, an interesting point to discuss. As Anders Enger Pedersen has argued, the appeal of maps as a way to communicate a specific sense of place is that they can be easily shaped in a way that apparently lacks the slipperiness of language. They can have the lure of a self-explanatory representation and bear a promise, or maybe an illusion, of clarity, transparency, and order, even when their message is deeper and more complex than what transpires. And I think that precisely this illusion may have pushed the Tokugawa to use them as ways to transmit to a larger public a specific idea of the national space as something that was stabled and ordered under their domain. This may have been the reason why they allowed and even encouraged the commercial divulgation of adapted versions of their administrative maps in the first place. On the other hand, even when using administrative maps as models, publishing houses tended to apply textual and visual stylistic choices, which were obviously meant to make the maps more appealing to the public, that in a way ended up contradicting the original narrative, incorporating instability and movement in their representation of space in a more explicit way. Let's see how this concretely works in Tōkaidō bunken. The influence of a land survey sponsored by the Tokugawa is recognizable, I think, not only in the fact that the map is in scale, but also in the focus the map puts on crucial elements of road infrastructure. For example, the stone guidebooks, the one you see up there, called the Ichiritsuka, which were distant markers placed around the Tōkaidō and other highways, which are coupled in the map on the right upper half with precise indications about distances near the name of each post station along the road. There are also in the lower part, the roadside pine trees, which are an iconographical constant along the road in the map, and bridges and water crossing facilities, as well as castles and fortresses. All these elements of road infrastructure have been created with the stimulus of the Tokugawa and symbolize stability under the Tokugawa rule. By giving relevance to these immutable features of the landscape, the map reflects a static conception of space, making, as I was discussing earlier, a silent argument about stability. On the other hand, the map also explicitly focuses on movement in at least two ways. First of all, it adds textual sections that introduce an ephemeral element to its representation of the road. For example, it includes indication relative to both services. You can see them near the river, and also mentions on the right the name of Tonia. Tonia were the traders or brokers who handled the sales and shipments and managed warehouses along the road. What's interesting about these elements is that they don't make much sense in practical terms in a map like this one. This sort of information was commonly prominent in more practically oriented maps meant to be taken along journeys. An example of this kind of maps are dochki, which literally means road record, and which, as you can see in this example, were structured as a very sketchy itinerary of post stations with lots of text. They listed castle areas, famous places, distances, couriers and their dispatch dates, the rates for pack horses and porters, shops, famous products, and so on. A map like Tōkaidō bunken, on the other hand, was clearly not devised for portability and use on the road. And I think it fell in the above mentioned definition of meta traveling tool. And this makes me think that the inclusion of these elements that I mentioned before is more performative than practical in scope. It was a narrative choice meant to turn the map into a more immersive armchair traveling experience and to embed the story about movement and change in the representation of the road. And this narrative effect is also achieved through visual element and above all by the inclusion of human figures, which were absent, totally absent from administrative maps. And Tōkaidō bunken consciously puts a crowd of travelers on the road, shifting the attention from the road itself to life on the road, with a crowd that is varied enough to reflect the many different purposes of the Tōkaidō and the many different backgrounds of the people who traveled it. There are warriors traveling for official business, workers alongside the road, but even people with no definite business relaxing in the fields. In this way, the map becomes an unfolding narration, a tool that, to quote a recent, book about temporality in maps, visualize a particular history that happened in the mapped landscape or territory. And this is also facilitated by the format of the map, which makes it possible to read it both as a progression of scenes and focusing on a single scene at a time, creating a sort of collection of snapshots of life on the road. This narrative of change and movement also emerges from the representation of different weather conditions on the road. In volume 2, a rainy scene is represented near Hara Post Station, while in the following scene, snow is represented on Mount Fuji. And this is, first of all, a nod to the passing of time and the alternance of seasons on the road, which added to the realism of the experience of travelers as represented on the map. But I find it also interesting that this specific section of the map was chosen for showing seasonal change, because Hara was a smaller and not particularly strategical post station, but this choice makes it stand on the map in a way. I think this choice was probably connected to the status of Hara as a meisho, or famous place, in association with Mount Fuji, an association which is highlighted in many other instances of Edo period art. Mount Fuji was probably the most famous of the famous places on the Tōkaidō, and it was renowned both as a sacred area and a place of lyrical significance, what in Japanese is called utamakura. This relevance is the reason why the mountain very peculiarly appears repeatedly in several different sections of Tōkaidō bunken, not as a point on the map per se, but rather as a landscape that you could see from the road and appears in different sections. And I think the rain in Hara and the snow on Mount Fuji may have been meant as a nod to this status of Fuji as a meisho, because meisho were typically associated both in classical poetry and art with different seasons and weather conditions. And so the inclusion of these elements was possibly a way to suggest a lyrical reading of the landscape. And this impression, and then I will go to my conclusion, is reinforced if one looks at the 1752 pocket edition by Yorozuya Sebe that I mentioned earlier, because here a rich text is added to the map, which in association with the images, and this text includes classical poetry and historical narrations connected to the landmarks on the map, which made the lyrical reading of the landscape even more explicit, bringing the long history of meisho as places of historical and lyrical importance into the narrative of the map. I think this is interesting also because it adds a complex temporal layer to the map, because the map, as I was saying, portrays a slice of present time in the journey, showing us different events happening synchronously along the road, but it also points this way to the past and to historical times. And one, I guess, could also argue that it shows the idea of possible future travels. And in this sense, to quote Caroline Winter and Karen Wiegand, the map gives physicality to the passing of time. So to conclude, I find Tōkaidō bunken to be a very poignant example of a map where literature and cartography are brought into contact for two reasons. Because one, of its explicit narrative element, and two, because of how it uses intertextuality, highlighting the mutual influence between maps and other contemporary literary and artistic genres connected with topography. The map can be looked at as a text in the sense Harvey has proposed, by treating it as a rhetorical tool to be deconstructed, looking for the power it embedded, for example, the sense of place instilled in the landscape by the Tokugawa, and for the conflicting cultural meanings it conveyed, but it can also be read as a narrative where the focus is not only, or even not primarily, on the road per se, but on the people who inhabit and use it, and on the lyrical dimension and history of the places along it. And many thanks for your attention.